Couldn't Congress simply shift over the $40 billion and not add to the debt? In the defense of Ukraine, if the defense of Ukraine is really in our national security interest, shouldn't the gift come from our military budget? What about cutting wasteful spending? My office cataloged over $50 billion in waste. I don't know about you, but couldn't we cut programs like the $1 million study to see if taking selfies of yourself while smiling and then looking at these selfies later on, if that makes you feel good? Or couldn't we cut the budget of the National Science Foundation that spends billions of dollars studying such burning questions as, do Panamanian city frogs have a different mating call than the country frogs? Couldn't we maybe cut the $2 million the NIH spent studying cafeterias to see if someone in front of you sneezes on the food, whether you're more or less likely to eat that food? Couldn't we maybe cut the money spent on Japanese quail, studying whether or not they're more sexually promiscuous or not when you give them cocaine? Or, if we're not willing to cut the budget at all, couldn't we ask the American people to stay up and pay a war tax? If this is really for our national security, it should be very popular with the people. Why don't we offer to tax them in exchange for this? Guess what? The American people don't want to cut spending anywhere in the budget, at least their representatives don't. They don't want to pay any taxes for this. They just say, put it on my tab. But we've been doing that for decades, and that's why we have a $30 trillion debt, and that's why we have roaring inflation. If you want to pay for this with a tax, you could triple the gas tax. I'm guessing that's going to be really popular, and people really want to send this money, so badly that they'd be willing to triple the gas tax. If we were honest, that's what the people who are for this would propose. Now, that would guarantee $5 gas for the foreseeable future. Alternatively, Congress could raise the income tax about $500 for every American taxpayer. I'm sure that would be popular. And for the people who think it's a great idea to send $40 billion overseas, why don't they just be honest with people and tax them? Here's your bill, Mr. and Mrs. America, $500 a taxpayer, and then what would it be paid for? No, it's like everything else. Put it on our tab. Well, Uncle Sam's tab is full. It is complete. To be clear, I'm not for raising taxes to finance Ukraine's defense, but it's irresponsible to simply borrow more money. To borrow the money from China simply to send it to Ukraine makes no sense and makes us weaker, not stronger. But let's be honest. Most of Congress doesn't seem to care about the debt, doesn't seem to care how much money we shovel out the door and out of the country. Why? Because it's not their money. Every day, Milton Friedman's statement is proven correct, that nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as their own. I doubt the big spenders in Congress will ever consider spending any of their own money, but Americans across the land should sit up and notice and attach blame to these profligate spenders. In the past 3 months, bipartisan majorities, Republicans and Democrats, have added over $100 billion to the debt. Now, these same big spenders are proposing another $50 billion next week to bail out restaurants that have been primarily injured by overzealous Democrat governors and their edicts. There are ramifications to this mountain of debt. Make no mistake, inflation is here, and it's rip-roaring and on the rise. Just as aiding the victims of fire in Georgetown during the days of Davy Crockett ignored the misfortune of the suffering people in lands too distant from Washington to be noticed, so too does today's deficit spending to be sent overseas ignores the pain and suffering and the inflation that is caused by that debt on everyday American families. Inflation is simply an increase in the money supply. It comes from the Federal Reserve buying the U.S. debt. M2 is a measure of the money supply. For the last 3 years, it's been going up at about a 15% rate. So we shouldn't really be surprised that there's inflation, because inflation is an increase in the money supply. In January of last year, the annualized rate of the M2 expansion, the monetary expansion, was 27%. No one should be shocked. We have inflation. We have rising prices in the grocery store. We have rising prices at the pump because we borrowed too much money. We went heavily in debt, and the Federal Reserve is buying the debt. All of this so-called free money floods the market and chases prices higher. Adding to our debt will only make the problem worse. So yes, our national security is threatened, not by Russia's war on Ukraine, but by Congress's war on the American taxpayer. The vast majority of Americans sympathize with Ukraine and want them to repel the Russian invaders. But if Congress were honest, they'd take the money from elsewhere in the budget, or ask Americans to pay higher taxes, or heaven forbid, loan the money to Ukraine instead of giving it to Ukraine. But Congress will do what Congress does best, spend other people's money. I, for one, will not. I will vote no. Somehow, somewhere, a voice of fiscal sanity must remain vigilant, must remain stalwart and steady in a sea of fiscal madness.